Good Saturday morning, everyone, and thanks for tuning in to another Southern Oregon weather weekend update. We'll start by discussing how our forecast verified for the first half of July. Then we'll discuss our 7-day forecast. We'll talk about what our teleconnections are showing for the next couple weeks, and then we'll discuss the latest ideas for August. So first, I want to call your attention to what the sea surface temperatures along the equator have been doing over the past couple weeks. You can see for most of the month of June, they were cooler than normal, and recently they've warmed to neutral to slightly above normal. So for much of the month of June, we had a La Nina-ish look to the sea surface temperature pattern, and now it looks more neutral. Again, this drop in the sea surface temperatures didn't officially meet La Nina criteria. It has to remain below a certain level for a certain number of months. But the atmosphere can respond to shorter time frame events like this as well. So because we were in a La Nina-like sea surface temperature pattern heading into the month of July, we were expecting a cooler than normal start to the month. That was one of the reasons why we favored average to below average temperatures. There were others as well. One of those other factors was the MJO. Here you can see at the start of the month, at the start of this blue line here, we were in phase 1 of the MJO. And when we combine phase 1 of the MJO with a La Nina type pattern along the equatorial Pacific, we would expect cooler than normal temperatures over the Pacific Northwest, and that is exactly what we got during the first half of the month. You can see that lines up with our 500 millibar pressure pattern, trough over the Pacific Northwest, and a ridge over the lakes. And here's the correlation with MJO phase 1 during La Nina years, or years where the waters along the equator were cooler than normal. That lines up very well with our observed conditions over the first half of the month in general. However, you can see that the water temperatures here have risen quite a bit over the last couple weeks, and really since the beginning of the month, we've seen neutral to even slightly above average sea surface temperatures in this Nino 3.4 region. And so again, because of that and some other factors, including the MJO progressing into phase 2, we were expecting some warmth to return around the middle of the month. And once again, that's what we've observed. We've seen some warmth start to creep in. And this was an idea that we highlighted back in June, that perhaps for a time we could be in a southern ridge, northern trough type scenario. And that's kind of what we've been seeing as the trough has retreated north just a little bit. Again, here's the pressure pattern at 500 millibars that corresponds to our temperatures. You can see the trough retreating to the north, this ridge building over the south, and then to our west as well. Now by this time, sea surface temperatures have warmed, and so we're no longer in a La Nina type pattern. And so in combination with phase 2, a more neutral ENSO pattern gives us this kind of a look, which again lines up very well with what we observed. Here is what we observed at 500 millibars, and this is the correlation that we would expect with the MJO moving into phase 2 and the ENSO regions warming into the more neutral range. So again, interesting to see how ENSO, the El Nino Southern Oscillation, and the MJO really drive our weather patterns. So let's talk about what to expect going forward. Well, here's the Weather Channel's forecast for the next week. You can see we're going to have some pretty significant heat over the next couple days. Nothing too record-breaking, and then we cool off here toward the end of the week, but for a couple days we have the possibility of triple-digit temperatures in the Rogue Valley. So let's talk about why this is the case. Here's our 500 millibar forecast from the American Ensemble, the GEFS. You can see the ridge that's been building offshore starts to shift over our area. This trough departs to the east, and the ridge builds over the Pacific Northwest. That ridge is gradually replaced by a trough as it shifts back west, it retrogrades into the Gulf of Alaska. And this trough starts to dive back down into the Pacific Northwest. And you can see by the end of the week, we're kind of back in the cooler pattern that we saw at the beginning of the month. So I think one of the main reasons for this is the MJO and some other factors. So here's the Canadian forecast for the MJO on the left and the European forecast on the right. And you can see we're starting kind of in the null phase. Sometimes these RMM plots don't really show where most of the MJO activity is located. So technically we wouldn't expect the MJO to have very much of an influence in this null phase, but it still can. Just like those water temperatures along the equator, we might not be in official La Nina territory, but we can still have a La Nina type look where waters are cooler than normal. The same thing can happen with the MJO. We might technically be in this null phase, but we can still have a phase 2 type influence. So you can see we start here right around phase 2, and then we make a jog back into phase 1 for a little while. And then we come back out into phase 2 and head toward phase 3. That's the general idea from both of these models. Well, phase 3 is a cooler phase. Phase 1 and 2, those are warmer phases, especially phase 1. And so that phase 1 activity here is going to explain why we warm up, and then as we move into phases 2 and 3, that's going to explain why we cool back down for a time. Also, remember the key atmospheric drivers that we talked about 2 weeks ago. Those are still in play. So we have the negative AAM, basically the global wind speed anomalies, weakening of the jet. That's associated with cooler than normal conditions over the Pacific Northwest at this time of the year. We also have the PNA expected to fall again over the next couple days. Again, that's a cooler signal. And we also have the Southern Oscillation Index, which has been largely neutral to positive over the last couple weeks. And that, again, is also a cool signal. So these drivers haven't really changed. And so we'd expect that after a brief attempt at warmer temperatures that these drivers would reassert themselves and we're going to cool back down. So that, I think, is why the Weather Channel is forecasting some warmer temperatures as we're temporarily in those warmer MJO phases, phases 1 and 2, and then some cooler temperatures as we move possibly into MJO phase 3 and those key atmospheric drivers reassert themselves again. So before we finish, let's talk about what we can expect for August. If you remember from the last forecast, we talked about this analog. So again, analogs are years that had a similar evolution to the current year with regards to temperature, pressure patterns, key teleconnections, things like that. 2005 lines up pretty well with this year, and you can see that there was some significant warmth not only along the eastern seaboard and the Great Lakes, but along the west coast as well. And that's something that so far we haven't really seen. We've seen cooler than normal conditions so far, at least for the first half of the month. And so because of this, I was talking about risks for heat later into the month of July and into August during the last forecast. And I think that's still in play. You can see what happened in 2005. The MJO progressed in a manner very similar to what we've seen so far, where we start here in phases 1 and 2, and then we move into these warmer phases. phase 3 is a cooler phase, but then phases 5, 6, and 7 are very warm phases during the month of August. And I think that could happen. And you can see some of the models are calling for this. I showed you the European model. Here's the European ensemble. Again, this jog into phase 1 is going to give us our warm temperatures for the next couple of days. And then we move into phase 2, possibly into phase 3, and cool down. But then toward the end of the month and heading into August, look where we go, into these warmer phases. Some models, like the American ensemble, skip phase 3 entirely and want to take us directly into the warmer phases. And so that is a risk. Here you can see the temperature correlations for phases 6, 7, and 8. They're quite warm, and the skill associated with this correlation is pretty high. So in other words, it's a kind of a sure bet that if we move into these phases, we're going to warm up in August. Also, I showed you this angular momentum forecast from the European ensemble. You can see it's repeatedly been trying to take the angular momentum positive, and it's kind of failed each time. But I think the AAM is going to turn positive at some point. It's just a matter of time. And if that does happen in August, that's another piece of evidence for heat during August. So, let's summarize all that information. We did see our forecast pan out for the first half of the month. We did have a cool start to the month due to those cooler MJO phases, and because we were under the influence of those cooler La Nina-like temperatures along the Pacific. However, we've seen some recent warming, and that was expected as well. Not only because our ENSO regions have warmed, but also because we've moved into some warmer MJO phases. And it looks like we have some triple-digit temperatures to contend with at the start of this week. Once again, that's associated with those warmer MJO phases 1 and 2. But it looks like we can expect cooling mid to late week. Once again, as those key atmospheric drivers reassert themselves, they haven't gone anywhere. We still have the negative AAM. We're still going to see a negative PNA. We have this SOI, Southern Oscillation Index, rising. And it looks like we can move into MJO phase 3. Again, an alphabet soup. But it all means that this heat spell is not going to last for a very long time. We do have the potential for heat to return late month as the PNA rises and as the MJO progresses into those warmer phases, 6 and 7. Or it could possibly reload in phase 1, which is also a warmer phase. And to conclude, we did talk about risks for heat in August because of that 2005 analog, the angular momentum going positive, and those warm MJO phases. So guys, thanks so much for tuning in. I'm going to try to post regularly again once a week, so don't forget to set your notifications for that next weekend update. And please leave a like if you enjoyed the forecast.